It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything feels calm until it doesn't. I was taking a walk down the gravel road near my house, something I did almost every night. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't anything too unusual for late autumn. The moon hung low, casting enough light that I didn't feel completely alone, but not enough to make the shadows disappear. I had just rounded the corner when I heard the sound of paws padding behind me. It wasn't fast, more like a slow, steady pace, and it sounded like it was keeping distance, but it was there. I thought it was just a neighbor's dog, maybe following me for a bit, so I didn't worry at first. But then, it stopped. I couldn't hear it anymore. I slowed my walk, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing. No dog. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. But then, the sound came again. This time it was closer. A few feet away, maybe. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the tightness building in my chest. That's when I heard it. A low growl, not from a distance, but from right behind me. My heart skipped, and I turned, half expecting a large, growling dog. But there was nothing there. Just empty road. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that made me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. I kept moving, faster now. I told myself I was just overthinking it. Dogs bark all the time. Maybe it was a stray that had wandered off, or something else, but whatever it wasn't following me. The growl from behind wasn't real. I told myself that, but then, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of something brushing against my leg. My heart slammed into my chest as I spun around. A dog, its eyes wild and unblinking, was standing inches away. It was thin, too thin, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it had this unnerving, almost hungry look in its eyes. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The dog didn't bark. It didn't make a sound. But it was there, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, we just stared at each other. I felt the fear crawl up my spine. It was like this dog wasn't just a stray, it was something far more dangerous. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the dog backed up slowly, its eyes still on me. It turned and disappeared into the darkness of the trees on the side of the road, vanishing like it had never been there. I stood still for a few seconds, waiting for the air to settle, my heart still pounding. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to finish my walk. I turned around, retracing my steps quickly, until I reached the safety of my house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with a nervous hand. I don't know if it was just a wild dog, or if something about it felt different, like it was stalking me for a reason. But I do know this, after that night, I stopped walking that road. It might sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching, and I wasn't about to give it another chance to show up. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath. I had just finished work and was walking home down the empty street, the cold air biting at my skin. The streetlights flickered every now and then, casting long, uneven shadows on the pavement. I was just about to round the corner when I noticed them, a pack of dogs, maybe 4 or 5, standing across the street. They weren't barking or making any noise, just staring at me, unmoving. I slowed my pace, trying to get a better look. They weren't the usual friendly dogs you'd see around town. These were different. Their coats were matted, their eyes wild with something unsettling. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an aggression in their stillness. Something primal. It made my skin crawl. I glanced around, but there was no one else on the street. I wasn't far from home, but the idea of walking past those dogs, who seemed to be waiting for me, filled me with dread. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I tried to convince myself that maybe they were just stray dogs, hungry or lost, but the way they stood there, so still and focused on me, told me otherwise. I started walking again, this time more cautiously, keeping an eye on the dogs. I hoped they'd just leave me alone. But as I took a few more steps, I noticed something worse. One of the dogs had started moving, slowly circling around to the other side of the street. I froze. The others didn't move, but this one, it was moving closer, keeping its eyes locked on mine. Its low growl was the only sound I could hear. I picked up my pace, not running, but definitely speeding up. My mind raced. Should I turn back? Keep walking? The dog was closing the distance, now only a few yards away. I glanced behind me and saw that the rest of the pack hadn't moved. But this one, the one circling, was definitely coming for me. I wasn't sure why, but I instinctively reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It felt stupid, but I dialed 911 quickly. I didn't know what I would say. There's a dog following me, but the line rang. I didn't care, I just needed someone to hear me. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, which only made me feel more on edge. I think I'm being followed by a dog, maybe more than one, I stammered. I'm just walking home, and they're acting weird. I could hear her typing in the background. Are you safe? Can you get to a public place? I'm on the street, but there are no cars, no people. It's just me and these dogs. One's moving toward me, I said, my breath coming faster now. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. Is there a way you can get to shelter? I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest. I was only a block away from my apartment. I decided to make a break for it. I told the operator I was going to run and hung up quickly, trying to stay as calm as I could. I turned and sprinted, not looking back. I could hear the dog's paws behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't barking. It was just running after me, almost like it was toying with me. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning. My apartment was close. Just a little farther. I made it to my building and shoved the door open, slamming it behind me as I gasped for air. I leaned against the door, heart racing. I didn't know if the dog was still out there. I didn't know if the others were waiting, but for now, I was safe. I made sure to lock the door. I don't know what it was that made those dogs follow me, whether they were just hungry, confused, or something darker, but I know one thing for sure, I'll never walk down that street again after dark. I don't know if they were just strays or something more, but the look in their eyes made it clear that sometimes, what seems harmless at first can quickly turn into something much more dangerous. I'm just glad I made it home in one piece. It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything feels a little too still. I had just finished work and decided to take my usual walk through the neighborhood to clear my head. I liked the routine, the cool air, the quiet streets, the familiar houses. It was peaceful. As I turned down an alley that cut through a row of houses, I heard something behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a cat scurrying through the grass. But then, I heard it again, soft, steady footsteps. It didn't sound like someone walking, though. The steps were too heavy, too uneven, like something else was out there. I slowed down, trying to figure out what it was. A few seconds later, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps weren't following me in a straight line, but more like they were circling, closing in. My pulse quickened, and I turned my head, half expecting to see someone walking toward me. But there was nothing, no one. Just empty space. Then, I heard a growl. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but deep enough that it sent a chill through me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The growl came again, a little closer this time. My mind raced. What the hell was it? A dog? But it didn't sound like any dog I'd ever heard. The growl was raw, almost like it was coming from something much bigger, something wild. I started walking faster, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray dog was out there, or maybe I was just hearing things. But then I heard it again, closer. I broke into a jog, the sound of those heavy steps behind me growing louder with every second. I didn't dare turn around. My only focus was getting home. I took a sharp turn onto the main road, hoping the streetlights and the noise from passing cars would make me feel safer. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it. A large shadow moved quickly across the street, barely visible in the dim light. Its shape was huge, almost unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the glow of eyes staring directly at me. Panic set in, and I sprinted toward my apartment, my legs burning from the effort. My mind was a blur of thoughts. What was it? Why was it following me? But I didn't stop running, not until I reached my front door. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I finally managed to unlock the door and slam it shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. Nothing. No growl. No footsteps. Just silence. I locked all the doors and windows, pulled the curtains, and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that shouldn't have been. Hours later, I walked to the window, pulled back the curtain slightly, and peered outside. The street was empty, just like
I've always loved going for walks in the woods. It's a quiet place, where I can be alone with my thoughts. The path is familiar, stretching out through the trees, thick with underbrush and the scent of pine. On this particular day, the sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. I wasn't far from the usual trail when I noticed something strange. There was a large tortoise, moving slowly along the ground, its shell a dark green, blending with the damp forest floor. It wasn't the tortoise itself that caught my attention, it was the rabbits. A group of them. I hadn't seen them before, and they were acting strange. They weren't just hopping around, nibbling on the grass, like I'd seen in the past. No, these rabbits were watching the tortoise. I stopped, keeping my distance, not sure if I should turn back. The rabbits weren't running or playing. They were huddled together in a circle, eyes fixed on the tortoise, their bodies stiff and tense. Something about the scene felt off. It wasn't normal. I continued walking, keeping an eye on the animals, but the whole situation felt wrong, as if I had stumbled upon something I shouldn't have. The tortoise was still moving slowly, like it didn't even notice the rabbits. But the rabbits were different. They seemed to be waiting, anticipating something. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the rabbits had a scratch on its ear, like it had been through a fight. The others seemed fine, but there was a tension in the air, a strange quietness. I quickened my pace, hoping to get past them, but as I did, one of the rabbits darted in front of me, blocking my path. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, as if trying to warn me of something. My heart began to race. I had no idea what was going on, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I tried stepping around the rabbit, but it lunged at my foot, its sharp teeth barely missing my boot. I jumped back, adrenaline pumping through my body. The other rabbits were now moving, surrounding me in a way I hadn't noticed before. They weren't attacking, not yet, but they were watching. Waiting. The tortoise had stopped moving, its head lifted, its eyes fixed on me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and strange. Then, something happened. A rabbit lunged at me, but I reacted just in time, pushing it away with my foot. The others seemed to hesitate, as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. I felt trapped. Out of nowhere, I remembered a path, an old route that led back to the main road, and without thinking, I bolted in that direction. I didn't stop running until I reached the clearing. The rabbits didn't follow, but I could still feel their eyes on me, even from a distance. My breath was ragged, and I felt a deep, sudden fatigue in my legs. As I stood there, catching my breath, I glanced back toward the woods. It was quiet. The tortoise and the rabbits were gone, vanished into the underbrush, as though they had never been there. I waited a moment longer, my heart still thumping in my chest. Nothing moved. I never went back to that part of the woods. But sometimes, when I'm out walking, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're watching, waiting for me to return. It was a late afternoon when I decided to go for a walk through the woods. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the path. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. A tortoise, its shell dark and rough, was slowly making its way across the trail. It wasn't moving quickly, but there was something off about it. It didn't belong here, at least, not this far from any pond or stream. I paused, watching the tortoise. There was no reason for it to be so far from water, and something about the way it moved felt wrong. It didn't seem like any tortoise I had seen before. Its steps were too jerky, its eyes too wide and unnaturally bright. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks, and walked past it. As I continued down the path, I heard rustling in the bushes. My eyes darted to the side, but nothing was there. I quickened my pace, feeling uneasy, but tried to tell myself that it was just a rabbit or some other animal. But then I heard the sound again, closer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't the usual rustle of small animals. This was heavier, deliberate, almost as if something was moving with purpose. I turned around and froze. The tortoise was no longer where I had left it. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the path. There, just a few feet ahead, I saw it again. The tortoise. But this time, it was standing still, staring at me, and I could see its shell wasn't just dark, it looked slick, almost wet. And those eyes, they seemed to follow me as I slowly took a step back. A noise from behind startled me. I spun around, and to my shock, a group of rabbits had appeared on the path. They weren't just hopping around, as rabbits normally do. They were crouched low, their eyes focused on me, not blinking. The way they moved didn't feel natural, like they were waiting for something, or someone. The atmosphere was thick with tension. I began to walk faster, my steps quick and uneven. The rabbits didn't move. They just stared, their bodies tense. I was sweating now, heart racing. What was going on? I turned my head again to check the tortoise. It was closer. I could hear its legs scraping against the dirt as it moved slowly but steadily toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, too heavy to move. I had to get out of there. I needed to get away from whatever this was. As I took another step backward, a sharp rustle came from the trees ahead. The sound of movement was too fast, too purposeful. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. The tortoise was only a few feet away now. It was much bigger than before, its shell almost as wide as the path itself, its eyes wide and reflecting the last light of the dying day. The rabbits hadn't moved, but there was something in their stillness, something wrong. Finally, I found the strength to run. I didn't care about the way my legs felt, about how hard it was to breathe. I just ran. I heard the sound of something heavy scraping behind me, the tortoise's pace quicker now, the rabbits darting out of my peripheral vision. The woods were closing in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart leap into my throat, but then, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the woods. The path opened up, and the sounds from behind me stopped. I dared a glance back. The woods were empty, the tortoise gone, the rabbits no longer standing in eerie silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, my body trembling. I was on the edge of a small field now. The air was cooler, calmer. I looked behind me again, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I was safe. The nightmare was over. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't care how much sunlight was left. I turned and walked quickly away from the woods, never looking back. When I finally reached the safety of my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a while, just trying to catch my breath. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of those rabbits. The way they had watched me. The way they had waited. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know why it felt like the forest itself had turned against me. But I know one thing. I'll never go back to those woods again. Not ever. I don't think I want to know what happens when those tortoises and rabbits are together. It's better to forget. The forest of the forgotten paths. It started when I decided to take a shortcut through the woods. It seemed like the perfect route to avoid the long, winding road home. I'd walked through these woods before, but always on the beaten path. This time, I strayed. The trees were thick, casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. The air smelled earthy, wet from recent rain. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed the path narrowing, the familiar trail disappearing behind me. I tried to shrug off the unease creeping up my spine. There were rabbits around here, sometimes. I spotted a few as I moved further in, darting past the underbrush. It made me feel a little better, nature, life, all around me. But then something felt off. The more I walked, the quieter the woods became. No birds, no rustling of leaves. Even the rabbits had vanished. I kept walking, trying not to let my mind wander. But the trees seemed to close in on me. I came across a large rock, partly buried in the ground, with what looked like worn markings along its surface. I didn't think much of it, at first. I just needed to keep moving, to get out of here. But my feet were heavy. I started to feel as though something was watching me. I shook my head, tried to brush it off. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger. Then, I saw it, a tortoise, slow and steady, moving along the same narrow path ahead of me. It was an odd sight, considering how rare it was to see one here, especially so far into the woods. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was how it was moving, straight toward me, its eyes fixed, unblinking. I froze. The tortoise was too calm, too deliberate. I took a step back, and it kept coming. I moved again, this time trying to maneuver around it. But no matter how I tried to step aside, the tortoise didn't change direction. It kept inching toward me, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. I started to back away slowly, heart pounding, but it felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. I stumbled, almost losing my balance. When I looked back up, the tortoise was closer, its shell glint. I was walking home through the woods, as I always did, when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A tortoise. But not just any tortoise, this one was massive. Its shell was covered in dirt and moss, as though it had been here for years. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no. There it was, just sitting there in the middle of the narrow path, staring at me with eyes that were too wide, too alert for a creature so slow. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. I backed up, careful not to make any sudden moves. The air around me felt heavier, like something was off. I looked around, no other animals, no birds chirping, just dead silence. I had always walked this trail, and this was the first time I'd seen anything like that. As I moved to step around it, the tortoise started moving. Slowly, as you'd expect, but something about its movements didn't seem natural. It wasn't just plodding along like I had seen before in my neighborhood park. It was deliberate. It almost seemed to be following my steps. I picked up the pace, hoping to just get out of its way. That's when I heard the noise. It was a low rustling, coming from the underbrush behind me. I turned, heart pounding, but nothing. Maybe a rabbit, or some small animal moving through the leaves. But no. I heard it again, closer this time, and that's when I saw them. Rabbits. A dozen of them, standing perfectly still in the bushes, their eyes all focused on me. I couldn't breathe. The rabbits weren't moving. They weren't twitching like they normally do when startled. They just stared. All I could think was that something wasn't right. Why were they so still? Why were they watching me? I started to walk faster, trying to push away the panic that was building in my chest. But I could feel something was behind me. That tortoise. It wasn't far anymore. I broke into a run. I wasn't looking back, but I could feel it, that heavy, deliberate pace. I could hear the soft scraping sound of its shell dragging over the dirt. Closer and closer. My legs burned, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. My breath was coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Then, there was a loud rustling sound, followed by a series of thumps, like something heavy had dropped. I stumbled, almost falling as I spun around. The tortoise was no longer following me. It had stopped, right there in the middle of the path. And behind it, the rabbits. They were all around it now, as if they had suddenly come to life, hopping and darting in every direction. But they weren't acting like normal rabbits. They were too fast, too coordinated. I stood frozen, watching. I didn't know whether to run or stay. But in that moment, everything just stopped. The rabbits scattered, running off in all directions. The tortoise, too, slowly turned and began to crawl back into the underbrush, disappearing just like that, without a sound. I stood there for a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally got the courage to walk again, I kept my eyes on the ground, terrified that I would see something else. But the woods were silent again, almost peaceful. The normal sounds of nature had returned. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the woods, my heart still pounding in my chest. It was as if whatever had happened back there, whatever I had seen, wasn't real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never walk that path again. Some things are better left unknown, and that day, I learned there are some creatures in this world you just don't mess with. It was a late afternoon when I first noticed them. I was walking down the dirt path by the forest, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The place always gave me a feeling of quiet unease, like something was just out of sight, waiting. As I neared the old oak tree, I saw them, 2 rabbits. They were just sitting there, staring at me. Their fur was clean, but their eyes were different. Big, dark, and too still. They didn't hop away like most rabbits do when you get too close. I tried to shake off the weird feeling crawling up my spine, but I couldn't. I kept walking, passing them quickly. But the moment I did, I felt it. A sudden rustling behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a deer or a bird. But it was just those same 2 rabbits. They hadn't moved, but something felt wrong. I could swear they were closer now. I tried to ignore it and walked faster. But then I heard something else, something that wasn't normal. The sound of something slow, dragging. I turned again, but this time it wasn't just the rabbits. There, in the distance, moving just at the edge of the trees, was a tortoise. Its shell was dark, the kind of dark that didn't reflect any light, like it was sucking in everything around it. Its head was low, almost touching the ground, as if it was crawling without a care in the world, but that dragging sound, it was coming from it. The tortoise wasn't moving normally. It was dragging its shell along the dirt, leaving a long, deep trench in its wake. The rabbits didn't leave either. They were now all around the tortoise, moving in a tight circle, and I felt my stomach tighten. I had to get out of there. I turned and started walking faster, but the path seemed longer now. Like I wasn't getting anywhere. And behind me, the sound of dragging followed. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. Slow, steady. Closer. It was only when I reached the end of the path, panting, hands shaking, that I looked back. The rabbits and the tortoise were gone. The path behind me was empty. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself, but nothing made sense. What was that? Was I imagining things? I didn't go back to that path for a long time after that. When I did, I was with a friend. It was bright daylight, the sun high in the sky, and there were no strange rabbits or tortoises. Just the usual forest animals, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I hear that dragging sound again. Very faint, almost like it's in the back of my mind. And I can't help but wonder if something was there that day, something that shouldn't have been. Maybe I'll never know what it was, but I've learned to trust that feeling of unease. Some things aren't meant to be figured out. And when I hear the rustling of the grass, I don't stop to look anymore. I just keep moving. The sun had just set, and the woods were quieter than I'd ever known them to be. I'd been walking for what felt like hours, alone, my only company being the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I should have turned back by now. The path I'd chosen wasn't marked on any map, but curiosity had pulled me this far. The trees here were thicker, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and the air felt colder, even though it was still fall. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were signs of animals, broken twigs, fur, and patches of dirt scuffed up in patterns. But it wasn't just any animal. It was like the footprints of rabbits, but much larger, almost unnaturally large. I tried to shake off the growing unease. The woods were full of wildlife, after all. Maybe it was just an odd animal I hadn't seen before, but then, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, quick, sharp, and then another, followed by a rustling sound. I froze, straining my ears. It was too precise to be the wind. Something, or someone, was out there. I stepped off the main trail and crouched low, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling grew louder. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet didn't move. I had to know what it was, and then, I saw them. Rabbits. But these weren't normal rabbits. They were unnaturally large, almost the size of dogs. Their fur was matted, and their eyes glowed strangely in the dimming light. They moved quickly, darting between the trees, their ears twitching at the slightest sound. I should have backed away then, but something rooted me to the spot. I watched as one of the creatures paused, sniffing the air, and then, without warning, it turned toward me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't the way a rabbit would look at you. It was as if it had seen me, really seen me, and it wasn't afraid. My body was still frozen, my legs unwilling to move as the creature took a slow, deliberate step toward me. It was almost as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me to react, to make a move, to give it a reason to do something. I had to snap out of it. I turned quickly, forcing myself to run, my feet pounding against the forest floor, the sound of the rabbit's movements echoing around me. I didn't dare look back. The trees around me seemed to close in, and every sound, every snap of a twig, felt like it was just behind me. I ran blindly for what felt like forever, until I suddenly broke through the trees and found myself back on a familiar road. My chest was heaving, my throat dry, and I could barely catch my breath. I kept running, though. I didn't stop until I made it to the nearest town, where the lights of the street lamps felt like a safety I hadn't realized I needed. I never did find out exactly what those creatures were. But I know this much: there's something out there, in those woods, something that waits and watches. I'm never going back, and I'll never forget the feeling of those glowing eyes staring straight through me. And as for those rabbits, they weren't the kind you'd find in a storybook. They were something else. Something I'm not sure I want to understand. It was a late afternoon, and I decided to take a walk through the woods near my house. The trees had started to change color, their leaves now a mix of deep orange and dark red, and the air was crisp, a sign that autumn was settling in. I needed some fresh air to clear my mind. As I walked, the sounds of tea. I was just walking down the trail by the lake, enjoying the quiet morning. The sun was peeking through the trees, casting long shadows on the dirt path. It was one of those peaceful days where everything felt still, too still. I'd taken this route many times before, but today something felt different. Maybe it was the thick mist hanging in the air, or the way the leaves rustled with no breeze. As I walked, I noticed something strange off to my left. A turtle, but not like the ones you see in pet stores or on the side of the road. This one was huge, its shell dark and almost glossy, with streaks of strange, muted colors across its back. The weirdest part, though, was that it was moving unusually fast, sliding across the ground like it was in a hurry. I paused, unsure whether I should keep walking or stop and watch. Then, just beyond the turtle, I saw more movement: rabbits. They weren't just hopping around like you'd expect. They were arranged in a perfect line, heads bent low, their eyes fixed on the turtle. It was like they were waiting for something, watching it. I felt a weird chill crawl up my spine. The rabbits didn't run when I passed by them, which was strange. Usually, they scatter the moment they sense a human nearby. But these ones stood still, too still. I kept walking, telling myself it was all just a coincidence, that I was overthinking things. But as I moved further along the path, I started to hear soft noises. A sort of scraping sound, like something dragging against the earth. I looked back, and the turtle was still there, only now it was following me. And the rabbits, there were more of them, now on both sides of the trail, their eyes never leaving me. I tried to shake the thought from my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sound of those rabbits, their heads turned in perfect synchronization, made my heart pound. Each step I took, the scraping sound followed, growing louder. I couldn't bring myself to look back again. I was scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. The path ahead narrowed, the trees closing in on either side. That's when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, where the sun broke through the branches and illuminated the ground. I started running, not looking back. The scraping grew louder, faster, as if something was chasing me. I didn't dare slow down until I burst into the clearing. I stopped, gasping for breath. The turtle was nowhere to be seen, and neither were the rabbits. The air felt lighter here, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost them. But when I turned around, the trail was completely empty. No animals, no odd noises. Just the quiet rustling of the trees in the wind. I didn't know what had happened back there. All I knew was that it wasn't normal. And as I looked around the clearing, I saw something that made my skin crawl. Right in the center of the open space, where the light was brightest, there were tracks. Not from the turtle. These were deep impressions in the earth, like something heavy had been dragged there. The pattern was too symmetrical to be from anything natural. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I turned and ran all the way back home, heart racing, never looking behind me again. The animals never followed, and the rest of the day felt normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me the entire time I walked that trail. Something that didn't belong. Something that wouldn't forget. I haven't gone back to that trail. I've heard no one else mention it either. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see the eyes of those rabbits again, staring back at me from the edge of the woods. It started one late afternoon, when I decided to take a walk through the woods. I had gone this way hundreds of times, but that day felt different. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie quiet. As I walked deeper into the trees, I noticed something strange in the distance, a small, worn path I hadn't seen before. It was overgrown with weeds, but the dirt was freshly disturbed, as if someone, or something, had just walked through. I felt a strange pull toward it, and despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I kept walking. The path led me further from the main trail, and soon, I couldn't see the familiar landmarks that would guide me back. That's when I saw them, rabbits. At first, I thought they were just the usual fluffy creatures hopping around, but there was something off about them. They didn't move like rabbits normally do. They were still, almost too still, sitting in a line, all facing the same direction. I froze. Something in me said I shouldn't approach, that I should turn around and leave before I found out what was wrong. But my feet were heavy, and the curiosity gnawed at me. I stepped closer, eyes glued to the rabbits. They didn't blink, didn't shift. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then, from behind a thick bush, I saw it. A tortoise. It was slow-moving, almost painfully so, but its shell was a deep, unnatural black. The thing that made my stomach twist was how it seemed to move with purpose, as if it had a plan, like it wasn't just wandering the forest as I'd expect a tortoise to. I should have left then, should have run back to the safety of the main trail, but I didn't. I stood there, watching this strange procession of rabbits, all lined up like they were waiting for something. Then, as I watched the tortoise get closer to the line of rabbits, it stopped. The rabbits didn't move an inch, their eyes locked on the tortoise, as if they were waiting for it to tell them what to do. My heart started to race, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. There was a noise now, a low hum, almost like the buzzing of a distant hornet's nest. The tortoise raised its head, and for a second, I thought I saw something shimmer in its dark shell, something like a reflection, but of what? I couldn't say. The rabbits began to twitch, their bodies shaking as if they were struggling to stay still. And then, without warning, they all moved at once, but not like any rabbits I'd ever seen. It wasn't just a hop or a scurry. They shuffled, their movements jerky, mechanical almost, as if they were being controlled. I stumbled backward, my breath short, heart hammering in my chest. I turned and ran. Branches and bushes scratched at my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, not with that feeling of being chased, of something behind me. I didn't look back until I burst out of the trees and into the open field, where the sunlight was blinding, almost like a safety net. The noise had stopped. I was alone again, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears, but as I caught my breath, I realized something. The path I had followed, the one I thought was new, was the same one I had walked down earlier in the day. It was the same, except now, there were no rabbits. No tortoise. Only the quiet of the woods. I didn't know what I'd seen out there, what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be walking through that part of the forest again. I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to stay away. And so, I left. For good. The woods were never the same for me after that, but at least I was safe. The strange feeling, that eerie quiet, still haunted me when I closed my eyes. But I learned to live with it. I could never forget that day. I couldn't forget what happened on that path. I'd never walk that way again. It started on a quiet afternoon, when I decided to take my usual walk through the woods behind my house. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and the rustling of the trees was oddly soothing. I had passed through this forest countless times, but today felt different, like the air was heavier, as if the trees were watching me. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the path ahead. A few minutes into my walk, I noticed something odd, a large tortoise slowly moving across the trail. It wasn't a normal sight. I had never seen a tortoise that size before. It was massive, easily the size of a small dog, its shell covered in moss and dirt, as if it had been here for ages. I crouched down for a closer look, wondering if it was lost or hurt, but as I reached out to gently touch it, I heard something behind me. A soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart pounding. Rabbits. Dozens of them. At least 30 or more, all in different shapes and sizes, scattered across the path, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me. It was bizarre. Rabbits don't move in groups like this. They scattered around the tortoise, weaving in and out of the trees, yet none of them made a sound. I stood up, feeling uneasy, but didn't want to make any sudden movements. I started walking back, keeping my eyes on the tortoise, still unmoving, its gaze now fixed on me. As I turned around to leave, the sound of something scratching the ground behind me caught my attention. I looked back. The rabbits were following me, slowly at first, but then faster. I tried to pick up my pace, but the more I walked, the more they came. The woods, which had once felt like a peaceful escape, now felt like a trap. The rabbits moved in a strange pattern, encircling me. I could hear the sound of their paws against the dry leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I turned back to see the tortoise, still motionless, yet somehow closer now. My breath quickened as I started to run, heart racing, panic rising. The rabbits were getting faster, closing in on me, their eyes reflecting a disturbing, unnatural intensity. There was something off about the way they moved, as if they were being controlled, like they were part of some kind of strange plan I couldn't understand. I ran until my legs burn.